Welcome to our channel. Today, we're going to summarize Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen chapters 31 to 61. In chapter 31, Elizabeth reunites with her former suitor, Mr. Collins, who is now the rector of a nearby parish. The two have a pleasant conversation, but Elizabeth realizes that her feelings for him have not changed. In chapter 32, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy attend a play and encounter Mr. Wickham and his wife, Lydia. The meeting is uncomfortable, but the couple manages to maintain their composure and avoid any drama. In chapter 33, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy host a dinner party for their friends, during which they discuss various topics and enjoy each other's company. In chapter 34, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy receive news that Mr. Bennet has fallen ill. They immediately return to Longbourn to be by his side. In chapter 35, Mr. Bennet recovers from his illness, and the family is relieved and grateful for his improved health. In chapter 36, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy return to Pember. In chapter 37, Elizabeth's younger sister, Kitty, announces that she has fallen in love with a military officer named Captain Carter. Elizabeth is initially skeptical of the match, but eventually comes to accept and support it. In chapter 38, Mr. Darcy's cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, visits Pemberley and shares with Elizabeth some shocking news about Mr. Darcy's past. Elizabeth is troubled by the revelation, but ultimately decides to stand by her husband. In chapter 39, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy attend a dinner party at Rosings, where they encounter Lady Catherine de Bourgh. The meeting is uncomfortable, but the couple manages to navigate the situation with grace and poise. In chapter 40, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy return to Longbourn for Christmas, where they enjoy spending time with family and friends. In chapter 41, Elizabeth receives a visit from her childhood friend, Charlotte Lucas. Charlotte reveals that she is unhappy in her marriage to Mr. Collins and is considering leaving him. In chapter 42, Elizabeth tries to help Charlotte through her marital troubles, but ultimately realizes that there is little she can do to improve the situation. In chapter 43, news arrives that Mr. Bingley's brother-in-law has been accused of a serious crime. The news causes a stir in society and puts a strain on Mr. Bingley's relationship with his wife's family. In chapter 44, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy attend a ball, where they encounter Mr. Wickham and his wife, Lydia, once again. The meeting is tense, but the couple manages to maintain their composure and avoid any drama. In chapter 45, Elizabeth receives a letter from her sister, Jane, who reveals that she is pregnant. Elizabeth is thrilled for her sister and looks forward to becoming an aunt. In chapter 46, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy visit the seaside town of Brighton, where they spend time with friends and enjoy the sights and sounds of the coast. In chapter 47, Elizabeth receives a visit from Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who demands that she end her marriage to Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth refuses, and Lady Catherine leaves in a huff. In chapter 48, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy receive news that Mr. Collins has died. The news is shocking, and the couple travels to Longbourn to be with the family during their time of grief. In chapter 49, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy try to help Mr. Collins' widow, Charlotte, through her bereavement. However, Charlotte is distant and unresponsive, and the couple eventually decides to give her space. In chapter 50, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy return to Pemberley, where they spend time together and reflect on their relationship. In chapter 51, Elizabeth gives birth to a daughter, and the family rejoices at the new addition to their household. In Chapter 52, news arrives that Mr. Bingley's brother-in-law has been cleared of all charges. The news is a relief to the family, and the couple is able to resume their relationship without any further complications. In Chapter 53, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy attend a garden party, where they spend time with friends and enjoy the beautiful weather. In Chapter 54, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy travel to visit some of his relatives in Scotland. The trip is a success, and the couple enjoys spending time together in a new environment. In Chapter 55, Elizabeth receives a visit from her sister, Lydia, who reveals that her husband, Mr. Wickham, has abandoned her and their children. Elizabeth is troubled by the news, but resolves to help her sister in any way she can. In Chapter 56, Elizabeth travels to London to try and locate Mr. Wickham, hoping to persuade him to return to his family. She is successful in finding him, but he proves uncooperative, and Elizabeth returns home feeling discouraged. In Chapter 57, Elizabeth receives a letter from Mr. Darcy, who is still in London on business. He reveals that he has located Mr. Wickham and arranged for him to return to his family, offering to support him financially in exchange for his cooperation. Elizabeth is moved by Mr. Darcy's kindness and realizes how much he truly cares for her and her family. In Chapter 58, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy celebrate their daughter's first birthday. The occasion is joyous, and the family reflects on how much they have grown and changed over the years. In Chapter 59, Mr. Bingley and his wife return to England, and the family reunites for a dinner party at Longbourn. The occasion is festive and joyful, and the family enjoys spending time together once again. In Chapter 60, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy reflect on their life together, realizing how much they have grown and learned from each other. They feel grateful for the love and support they share and look forward to spending the rest of their lives together. In Chapter 61, the novel concludes with a happy and hopeful tone, as the family celebrates the start of a new chapter in their lives. The characters reflect on the lessons they have learned throughout the story, and the importance of overcoming pride and prejudice in order to form meaningful relationships. The reader is left with a sense of closure and satisfaction, as the characters' journeys come to a satisfying and fulfilling end. Thanks for watching. To read the full version of the book, click on the link in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for similar content.